This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM, all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hello and welcome to Philosophy Bakes Bread, food for thought about life and leadership.
Philosophy Bakes Bread is a production of the Society of Philosophers in America, aka SOPHIA. I'm Dr. Eric Thomas Weber.
And I'm Dr. Anthony Cashio. A famous phrase says that philosophy bakes no bread that is not practical. But we, in SOPHIA and on this show, aim to correct that misperception.
Philosophy Bakes Bread airs on WRFL Lexington 88.1 FM and is distributed as a podcast next. Listeners can find us online at philosophybakesbread.com, and we hope you'll reach out to us on Twitter at philosophybb, on Facebook at Philosophy Bakes Bread, or by email at philosophybakesbread@gmail.com.
Last but not least, you can leave us a short recorded message with a question or a comment or that bountiful, bountiful praise that Eric loves so much.
I do.
You can reach us at 859-257-1849. That's 859-257-1849. Please reach out to us and we can be able to play your message on the show. On today's show, we're excited to be talking with Dr. Bryan Van Norden about a Multicultural Manifesto, which is the subtitle of Bryan's December 2017 book titled Taking Back Philosophy. This is going to be a real fun episode.
Bryan lives in Singapore, where he is currently Kwan Thong Hood Cho Temple Professor at Yale-NUS College. A recipient of Fulbright, National Endowment for Humanities, and Mellon Fellowships, Van Norden has been honored as one of the best 300 professors in the U.S. by the Princeton Review.
He is also chair professor in philosophy in the School of Philosophy at Wuhan University, China, and professor of philosophy at Vassar College. You wear a lot of hats, Bryan.
That's true.
I do, yeah.
In his spare time, do you have spare time? He likes to play video games and poker, and I guess he does. He's even played in the World Series Poker in Vegas. Wow. Was that televised? Television, playing poker?
No, unfortunately it wasn't. They have a lot of events, and only some of them are televised. But if I ever do get on television, I plan to be just insufferable.
Excellent.
Well deserved, too.
We'll want to watch, definitely. Well, in addition to releasing his recent book that we've just mentioned called Taking Back Philosophy, a Multicultural Manifesto, Bryan has also authored and edited or translated a number of books on Chinese and comparative philosophy, including Introduction to Classical Chinese Philosophy, Readings in Later Chinese Philosophy, and Readings in Classical Chinese Philosophy. That's quite a lot of work you've done, Bryan.
Well, I largely did it because there wasn't enough introductory text available for students to learn about Chinese philosophy.
Right.
So I wanted to make sure that people had the resources to learn or to teach about it.
That's fantastic.
I use your Introduction to Classical Chinese Philosophy in my Asian philosophy class.
No kidding.
I'll be using it in this coming semester.
Oh, good. Thank you very much.
Awesome. No, thank you, right?
Yeah. No, thank you. No, it was very helpful. It was a very helpful book. It's fantastic.
I've gotten good feedback.
So, okay, Bryan, our first segment of the show is called Know Thyself.
Know thyself.
Yeah, as the title implies, we want to know whether you know thyself. So a little quiz right off the bat. We want to invite you to tell us about yourself, about your background, about how your background shaped who you are, how you got into philosophy. We'll ask you about what philosophy means to you, but first we really want to know, who is Bryan?
I'm a lot of things. I'm a husband, a father, an American, a little bit of a public intellectual, but the way that I earn my money is by being a professor of philosophy. So I teach students about philosophy. I teach them about reading skills, critical thinking, how to write well, and I enjoy doing it a lot.
Very nice. So tell us about young Bryan and something about what kind of person that was and how that may or may not have led to philosophy.
Well, when I was young, I picked up a book about philosophy, I guess because I thought it would just impress people if I read something about philosophy. I had no idea what it was. And honestly, my reaction was, well, this is a bunch of BS. And So I decided I don't need to read any more about philosophy. But then later, they reinstituted registration for the draft in the U.S. And although it was just registration for the draft, there was a discussion about whether we had an obligation to go if we were drafted. And so I went back to philosophy and I got interested in issues about political philosophy and what our obligations are to other people and to the state. And now, because philosophy actually meant something to me, I realized that it was actually very important and very interesting.
Aha. Ooh, I like that. The relevance really is what hooked you.
Later on, I was part of the generation after Mao died in 1976 and China opened up to the West again. So a lot of us were very excited about Chinese culture. And to be really honest, I was part of the Kung Fu craze after Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon became an international hit. So my initial interest in Chinese culture was kind of shallow, but it got me started thinking about it. So when I went to college, I already knew I wanted to take some courses in philosophy, although I originally planned to use that as the basis for becoming an attorney. And I just took courses in Chinese language and culture out of interest. But eventually I became interested in the question of whether or not I could combine the two interests. Mm-hmm. And I was told by my philosophy professors that there is no such thing as Chinese philosophy.
Whoa.
And I was told by my Chinese studies professors that my original instinct was correct and philosophy is BS.
Whoa. So you didn't see encouragement to think about philosophy related to interest in China from either side?
No, absolutely not. But my wife likes to tease me that I'm what psychologists call oppositional defiant, which is the characteristic of somebody who, if you tell them not to do P, they immediately do P. And so when people told me, oh, you can't study Chinese philosophy, I immediately started to investigate where could I get a doctorate in Chinese philosophy.
Just to be clear for our listeners, I don't believe that you're referring to urine, but rather the letter P.
Yes.
Is that, just to make sure, is that correct?
I'm succumbing to philosophical
I didn't even think about mentioning that.
Okay, because to do P might sound like something that you didn't mean, but...
That's true. Yes. So in other words, being oppositional defiant is if they tell you whatever you do, don't go and study Chinese philosophy. My reaction is, okay, I will go and study Chinese philosophy.
Just watch.
But you know, hopefully nobody's interfering with your bathroom activities. So no,
so far no.
So where did you end up going to study Chinese
you
philosophy?
Obviously found something, right?
Yeah, at that point, the only programs I could find among top philosophy departments were the University of Michigan and Stanford University. I got admitted to both. I ended up going to Stanford, and I think that worked out really well for me because I got to work with a number of leading figures in the field of Chinese philosophy, including the late David S. Nivison, and also Lee Yearly in the Religious Studies Department at Stanford, and P.J. Ivanhoe.
Well, those are two great schools. So why do you suppose if there's representation of Chinese philosophy at great schools, people elsewhere were so ignorant of it?
Well, the fact is there are very few schools that teach Chinese philosophy. So, for example, at the moment, there are only 9 doctoral programs in philosophy in the United States that have somebody on the faculty who teaches Chinese philosophy as an area of specialization.
Whoa.
Only 9 out of the 126 doctoral programs in philosophy in the United States.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That I did not know. Very interesting. So so I guess you were already hooked on the idea of Chinese philosophy before you went to Stanford. Is that correct?
I was, although to be honest, I didn't know very much about it because it was almost impossible to find good books about it. There were very few good books on Chinese philosophy when I first got interested in the topic. One of the classics is Feng Youlan's A History of Western Philosophy, but one of the problems is that Feng went to study philosophy in the United States, learned a Western perspective on Chinese philosophy, and then went back to China. So people don't realize that his history is actually very biased in favor of a certain Eurocentric understanding of philosophy.
Interesting.
So it actually isn't a very representative sample of Chinese thought.
And so people will look at this text in Chinese and say, this confirms our view, but actually it's because it was conditioned already.
Exactly. And it was translated into English by Dirk Body at the University of Pennsylvania, which was an amazing scholarly achievement because he had to translate not just Feng, but also the primary text that Feng was quoting in Chinese. So it's an impressive scholarly achievement, but it's not true that there are all these Platonists in ancient Chinese thought, the way Feng Youlan claimed. So I didn't know too much about Chinese thought when I went to Stanford. I had a lot to learn.
Well, presumably, you no longer think the philosophy's BS. Maybe a little bit.
That's true. That's true that I do not think that.
And you found a place to study Chinese philosophy. We're going to talk more about that in the next few segments, but we kind of like to end this segment by sort of asking a sort of really broad question, but we ask it of all our guests. It's my favorite question to ask. What is philosophy? Right? If it's not BS, and it's this sort of broader, it seems that both your advisors were wrong. What is philosophy?
Well, of course, that's a great question. I think there isn't a definition of philosophy that everybody who's been labeled a philosopher, even just in the European tradition, would subscribe to, because philosophy has meant different things to different people at different periods in history. Mm-hmm. For us now, though, I think we can say that philosophy is the intellectual discipline where we deal with issues that we think are important, but we don't yet agree about the method for resolving them. So if we agree about, for example, the method for answering questions about natural objects, that's physics or chemistry. If we agree about the method for resolving certain formal problems, that's mathematics. But there are all these interesting questions about ethics or about the ultimate nature of the universe beyond what is revealed by the natural sciences that we don't yet agree about the method for resolving, but we're still very interested in. And for me, that's what philosophy is.
That's very interesting.
That's a good answer.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Actually, that helps. In one sense, that helps me think about one issue that I've long worried about. And it also raises a question for your definition. Because in the field of psychology, there are very different strains, right? One you might call behaviorism, which just thinks that we should look at people's behavior to know about them. Another refers to depth psychology and, Freud or Jung kind of thinking and sort of examining our dreams and stuff and asking people questions about that. And so in one sense, your definition explains that there's a philosophical difference between the ways in which people are approaching psychology there. But doesn't that mean psychology is philosophy?
I think that one of the things I want to stress is that in saying that there's a way of characterizing what philosophy is, I'm not saying that the current institutional divisions between fields are accurate. So I think that sometimes psychologists are doing philosophy, and sometimes computer scientists are doing philosophy. Sometimes literature professors are doing philosophy. And that's okay with me, because I think that philosophers should be willing to talk to people in other departments. And I wish people in other departments were more willing to talk to people in philosophy departments.
Hear, hear.
Yep.
And on that wonderful note, I got to say that we're going to come back after a short break. This is Philosophy Bakes Bread. You've been listening to Eric Weber. That's me, my co-host Anthony Cashio, and the great Dr. Bryan Van Norden. We'll be back after a short break.
Welcome back, everyone, to Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is Anthony Cashio and Eric Weber here talking today with Dr. Bryan Van Norden about a Multicultural Manifesto, which is the subject of Bryan's new book, Taking Back Philosophy. In this second segment, we'll ask Bryan about his recent New York Times article about diversifying philosophy and how it relates to his 2017 book. Then in the next segment, we'll shift to asking about some of his earlier work in Asian philosophy and Chinese philosophy more specifically.
Bryan, in your book and in your New York Times article, you argue that philosophy has long been too Eurocentric. if you visit one of the few remaining bookstores out there, if you see the philosophy section, if they have one, you'll often see books by Confucius or Lao Tzu or Buddhists like Thich Nhat Hanh. Why say that philosophy is too focused on European and Western thought?
Well, the irony is that the average student and the average person is really interested in Chinese, Indian, and other kinds of philosophy, but academic departments are dogmatic in refusing to teach them.
Uh-huh.
So in a sense, the interest is there, but the departments are refusing to teach it or even to look seriously at the evidence that it is interesting, genuine philosophy.
Yeah, you're right. You can see the demand insofar as bookstores have them and sell the books, whereas they don't sell very many or nearly as many books about Western philosophy. Is that right?
Exactly. And so I think that's right. And I think that one lesson we can learn is that it's partly for the continued survival of philosophy as an academic discipline that we be willing to speak to some of the topics that really interest our students, including non-Western thought.
So as a follow-up, why do you think academic departments have been so reluctant to open up and think about non-Western philosophy?
Well, I hate to level an accusation this strong, but there is a kind of systemic racism at work.
Uh-huh.
So people just assume that there isn't anything such as Chinese philosophy. So on numerous occasions, I've had conversations with people who have said there isn't Chinese philosophy, and I say, well, what philosophy from the Chinese tradition or supposed philosophy from the Chinese tradition have you read that didn't impress you? And they say, oh, well, I haven't read any. It's just, what you would technically call invincible ignorance. It's just, you admit you don't know anything about it, but you're sure it's not philosophy.
Mm.
In my book, I give a case of a good philosopher who I admire in a lot of ways, but he wrote an article about the non-existence of Asian philosophy, and he admits in the article, it's really a blog post, he admits that the research he did for this blog post was reading one Wikipedia page about Asian philosophy.
Well, that's in depth, right?
Yeah.
So he read a Wikipedia page and then argued that there was no such thing as Asian philosophy.
Based on that level of understanding of Asian philosophy. Yeah. So there are also, reasons that are, more charitable to ascribe to people. Partly it's just ignorance. Because doctoral programs are not teaching anything about Chinese philosophy, it gives the impression that there is no Chinese philosophy. Because they don't teach Indian philosophy, it gives the impression there is no such thing as Indian philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
A third factor, I think, is that, as we know, philosophy departments are under fire right now from a bunch of different directions. Your show in particular likes to address the objection that philosophy doesn't make any difference to the real world. Right. And I think that's false. And we can talk about, why I personally think that philosophy makes a great deal of difference to the world. But also philosophy departments are under fire from other humanities and social sciences departments that single-mindedly pursue what Paul Ricoeur referred to as a hermeneutic of suspicion, which is interpreting texts solely on the grounds of trying to explain the reasons for the production of the text other than the text being truthful or plausible. So what power relations does the text reinforce, or what psychological needs does the text express? Those are legitimate questions, but they're not the only questions you can ask of a text. And in some cases, philosophy departments are the last bastion of what's called a hermeneutic of trust, where you trust that the text might be wrong, but at least it's worth taking seriously as a candidate for truth.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And your book is titled Taking Back Philosophy, your most recent book. It has as this titled, our subject for this episode, A Multicultural Manifesto. So maybe you can say a little bit about what multiculturalism is and what are you trying to make manifest?
Right. Well, in a sense, multiculturalism is simply, in this context, about recognizing that there are philosophical traditions other than the Anglo-European one. And I'm someone who loves the tradition that goes back to people like Socrates and before him back to Heraclitus and Parmenides and Thales. I love teaching that, and that is what initially got me excited about philosophy. But anyone who bothers to look realizes that there are thinkers giving new answers to similar questions or emphasizing questions that are clearly philosophical but peripheral in a lot of Western philosophy in both the Chinese and the Indian traditions. I'm myself just learning more about the various indigenous American traditions and the traditions of Africa, so I can't speak with as much authority, but they're certainly worth investigating and learning more about. So multiculturalism is just recognizing there are these other legitimate, valuable traditions that we can and should learn about. And it's a manifesto in the sense that I think there's increasing movement of demands on the part of younger philosophers and undergraduates to learn about these things. If I may, I went through several stages in my optimism about multicultural philosophy. When I started out, I thought somewhat naively, well, Chinese philosophy is so obviously philosophy and it's so interesting. All I have to do is present it to my colleagues and they will recognize that it's philosophy and they'll want to learn more about it.
No.
Yeah. There's just a dogmatic attitude that, no, it's not really philosophy. We don't even need to look at it. Then I went through a stage where I became kind of cynical and I said, well, I love what I do. I love teaching students, but the field just isn't going to change. And after years of watching the field not change in a substantive way, that just seemed to confirm my hypothesis. However, in the last couple of years, I've begun to have hope because I'm meeting all these graduate students in philosophy who, whether their main area of specialization is European philosophy or epistemology in the European tradition or Plato, they're open to the idea that there are other philosophical traditions and they want to learn about them. And students are demanding to learn more about this. So I think we really are at a point where we can apply pressure and begin to change the field. And in the part of the first chapter of my book, I actually give a political, suggestions about how we can transform the field.
Well, Bryan, I have a follow-up question, but whenever we hear technical terms on this show, we immediately ask you what they mean. And so for our listeners who aren't so familiar, in a nutshell, what's epistemology?
So epistemology is really simply the theory of knowledge. So what can we know? Can we know anything? For example, do we know, some philosophers will say, well, all knowledge really is based on what we directly experience with our senses. Other philosophers will say, well, no, there's some things like mathematical truths that can be suggested to you by things you physically perceive, but your knowledge that they're true is not based on a physical apprehension. It's based on some other kind of knowledge. So that's basically what epistemology is. And you find very detailed discussions of epistemology dealing with some of the same issues, but also raising some different solutions and some different issues in the Indian philosophical tradition. It's just clearly epistemology on any plausible definition.
Great. So I feel compelled, to be a devil's advocate for a moment, Bryan. This may not be my may not be my attitude. In fact, it's not, but I'm going to ask you it anyway. Why is multiculturalism a better approach to philosophy, Bryan? What if Europeans simply got it right?
Well, there's several reasons for studying non-Anglo-European philosophy. One of them is when you study it, you find out that there's just a lot of interesting original philosophy there that we haven't plumbed before. And so it is, in fact, when you bother to look at it, quite interesting. So, for example, virtue ethics, as you know, has had a revival in Western thought, particularly since the work of Alasdair MacIntyre. But most Western philosophers take Aristotle or Aquinas as the paradigm of a virtue ethicist. And they are great philosophers I deeply respect. But you get an alternative formulation of virtue ethics, an alternative conception of ethical cultivation and what the virtues are and what the good life is. If you look at, for example, Confucian thinkers like Confucius himself or Mengzi or Xunzi or other thinkers in that tradition. So it broadens the range of options you consider when you realize that other people have taken these alternatives seriously that you may never have thought of before.
Very nice.
Another reason why I think it's important to study non-Western philosophy is simply for the survival of the discipline. I mean, right now, 86% of PhDs that are awarded in philosophy go to people who are non-Hispanic white, even though only 60% of the population is non-Hispanic white. 2% of PhDs in philosophy are given to African Americans, even though African Americans constitute 13% of the population. And it is estimated that 20 individuals, not 20%, 20 individuals who are indigenous Americans have PhDs and are active in the field of philosophy right now.
20.
If we want philosophy to survive as a discipline, we have to be able to reach out to students of different cultural backgrounds so they can see why they should learn about philosophy. The demographics of the United States demand it.
That's good.
Very nice.
This sort of answer you gave to Eric kind of goes back to your definition of philosophy, kind of that you gave in the last segment, right? Where sort of we have all these questions, we have different methods that we kind of disagree on, kind of how to think about them or how to answer them. You know, you talked about virtue ethics. Are there some other examples of philosophical questions or problems that may be better informed or addressed by taking a multicultural approach?
Absolutely. Although consequentialism or its specific form of utilitarianism is well known to Western philosophers, we get an interestingly different version of it in Mozi, the ancient anti-Confucian philosopher, and those who follow him. So Mozi gives a really interesting thought experiment to try to argue that we ought to impartially care for everybody. And in contrast to the Confucian view, which is that we have what are sometimes called in the West agent-relative obligations. So to explain that to your audience, suppose I do in fact spend a lot of money on my own children, am I morally justified in doing that because I have a special obligation to them because they are my children? Or should I spend much more of the money I spend on my children on things like good charities like Oxfam that benefit children who are on the edge of starvation? And so that's an issue that is addressed in unique ways by the Confucians and the Moists. Yet another issue that I think is really interesting is that of individuation. And so many philosophers, as you know, probably the vast majority of philosophers in the Western tradition think that the universe is somehow composed out of distinct individuals. But in the Buddhist tradition, they're willing to question that assumption. And they give interesting arguments for that conclusion.
What do you mean by individuals when you say individuation? What does that mean to someone who's never heard of this stuff before?
Well, let me pick a really extreme example. Suppose you're an atomist, and you think that what exists are these independent atoms or independent subatomic particles that somehow interact with each other, but they're fundamentally distinct from one another. Well, then you've got a view of a universe where it ultimately goes down at some level to individual things. But what if it's impossible to define individuals independently of their relationships to other things? So you began by asking me who I am, and what did I tell you? I said, I'm a husband. That's a relational property. Right. I'm a father. That's a relational property. I'm a philosopher. That too is a relational property because it identifies me in relation to intellectual traditions and other people in the field. If you strip away my relational qualities, what's left?
Interesting. Yeah, because in a sense, an electron is a relational thing too, isn't it?
Exactly. And so the classic atomist view you get from the ancient Greeks, and that was revived by people like Dalton in early chemistry, has been undermined. And so actually, in a way, contemporary physics is closer to the view that you get in Huayan Buddhists, for example, like Fa Zhang in the Chinese tradition, who argue that everything has to be defined relationally.
Well, I am thrilled that we're going to come back after a short break to ask you more about Chinese philosophy in particular, because I want to hear more about this. But we do have to stop and take that break. Thanks, everybody, for listening to Philosophy Bakes Bread. We're going to come back after a short break with Dr. Bryan Van Norden. This is Eric Weber, and my co-host is Anthony Cashio. Thanks for listening.
If you're hearing this, that means podcast advertising works. WRFL is now accepting new applications for advertising in a selection of our original podcast series. If you or someone you know owns a business in Central Kentucky and would be interested in advertising on WRFL's original podcasts, please email development@wrfl.fm.
Welcome back, everyone, to Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is Anthony Cashio and Eric Weber having a wonderful conversation today with Dr. Bryan Van Norden about a Multicultural Manifesto, which is the subtitle of his 2017 book, Taking Back Philosophy. So we've been talking about taking back philosophy in the last segment. We asked him about his book, about the need for more diversity in philosophy in the last segment. In this segment, we're going to talk more about Asian philosophy and Chinese philosophy. We've actually had a number of general requests for more episodes of this nature, and so we're going to go that route this time. Bryan is a specialist in Chinese philosophy, and so we're going to ask him about his work on Confucian philosophy in particular. Bryan, in the last segment, we kind of let you get away with a few things. You started talking about virtue ethics and consequentialism, and I realized over the break, well, we know exactly what that is so well. We talk about it all the time that we don't even think about it too much. So maybe we'll invite you to say maybe a little bit about virtue ethics and then consequentialism. And as you mentioned, Confucius sort of presents a very strong version of virtue ethics. So maybe that'd be a good way to maybe jumping into a little bit about who Confucius is and why he's important and why we should think about his philosophy.
Sure. So one of the basic positions that quickly occurs to people when they start to think about ethics and try to decide, well, how do we know what's right and what's wrong, is some version of consequentialism. And you can formulate it in a bunch of different ways. But here's one really simplistic formulation, just to get the concept across. Why don't we say that the action that's right is the action that is going to produce the most happiness or the most pleasure or whatever thing we think is intrinsically good in the world? And then we have an obligation to perform that action. And if we perform something else, we've done something that is wrong. It's very intuitive at a certain level. But there are a couple of objections that are commonly raised to it. One of them is it seems like it's basically a version of the view that the end justifies the means, so that you could do pretty much anything in principle as long as it achieved the goal. So, for example, you could kill innocent people if it would save other lives, or you could punish the innocent if it would prevent a mob from rioting and causing even more violence. So an alternative to consequentialism is virtue ethics. And virtue ethics can take different forms. At a minimum, virtue ethics is the view that our ethics is incomplete unless we talk about the characteristics of the good person. So not just which action is correct, but what virtues does the good person who performs the action have, like courage or wisdom or benevolence? And if you don't already have those virtues, how do you cultivate them in yourself? So in the ancient Chinese tradition, you have the Moists, the followers of Mozi, and they were consequentialists. And they said, look, just aim to benefit humans in general, what they called impartial caring, and do whatever is going to benefit humans in general, regardless of whether those humans happen to be your parents or my parents or members of your state or members of another state. Just try to produce the best overall consequences for people in general. The Confucians had a form of virtue ethics, and they said, not only do we need to talk about how to cultivate the virtues, but also, and this is a more extreme form of virtue ethics, they said you can't always aim at what produces the seemingly best consequences impartially considered, because you have these special obligations to individuals, like my obligation to my children because they're my children, Or I give my students the example, I say, you are my students, and forever you will have been my students. So if you email me with a question 10 years from now, I'll go out of my way to answer it. Whereas a random person who emailed me, well, if I have time, I will, but geez, I'm really busy and stuff. So it's common among people in the virtue ethics tradition to say, we have to find a way of balancing these particular commitments we have against our general commitments to humanity, but there's no simple mechanical way to do that. There's no mathematical algorithm or mathematical way of figuring out what the best answer is. You just have to use wisdom, which is more like an art than it is like weighing something or a scientific procedure.
Interesting.
Are you suggesting that human beings cannot be reduced to numbers?
Exactly. and so the Moists don't, as you know, there are contemporary versions of consequentialism that really do try to mathematize very exactly which consequences we should perform and take into account probability theory and things like that. But the Moists have the basic intuition. You want to maximize certain goods. They single out wealth, populousness, and social order, at least in their original formulation of the position, as the goods that you want to maximize. And they say, well, all this Confucian talk about cultivating virtues, that's just a waste of time. Just aim at these good consequences and everybody will be better off.
Very interesting. So, Bryan, in the American culture anyway, there's sort of a somewhat racist kind of background where people would make jokes about what they would say Confucius say and so forth. It's kind of mean and unpleasant in one sense, and people laugh at that. But so the question is, for average people, and consider me one of them, who was Confucius and what value is there to studying his teachings?
Well, if I can, I'll take up on the first point you made about the kind of the racist stereotype about Chinese philosophy. One of the things I point out in my book is that in the Supreme Court decision from a few years ago that legalized gay marriage, in the majority decision, Justice Kennedy referred to Confucius and quoted him on the centrality of marriage to the human condition.
Really?
Not claiming that Confucius said that he supported gay marriage, because Confucius didn't say that, but just citing him and Cicero as examples of philosophers who had said how important marriage is to human life and human community. In his dissenting opinion, Justice Antonin Scalia said that Kennedy had lowered the status of the Supreme Court by reducing its opinions to, quote, the mystical aphorisms of the fortune cookie.
Ooh.
Yeah, but the unfortunate thing is that Scalia said explicitly what, as you point out, a lot of people think, although they know better than to actually say what they think. Now, the reality is Confucius, or as he's known in Chinese, Kongzi, was born around 551 BCE and died around 479 BCE. Some people would describe him as a traditionalist, but I like to describe him more as a revivalist, in the sense we might think of Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi as revivalists.
Uh-huh.
A traditionalist says, let's just keep doing things the way we've been doing. A revivalist says, there are these deep, challenging ideas in our intellectual tradition, and if we actually took them seriously, it would revolutionize the way we are doing things now, because we are not living up to the highest ideals of our tradition. And so Confucius was that kind of thinker. Now, there are a lot of difficulties in studying Confucius, because the collection of his brief dialogues and aphorisms, called the Analects in English, there are a lot of textual and historical issues that are raised by it. So what I usually tell people is that it may not be the best place to start if you're interested in learning about Chinese philosophy or Confucianism. Mengzi, also known by the Latinization of his name Mencius, is a next generation Confucian who much more clearly articulated the philosophical basis for Confucianism, providing philosophical dialogues, thought experiments, and various arguments for the Confucian position. Then later in the Confucian tradition, you get really interesting thinkers like Wang Yangming, who argue that it is impossible to know what is good, yet not be motivated to do what is good.
That's a good one.
Dai Jun, who tried to give a naturalistic foundation for ethics in the universalizability of our innate desires. And Zhang Xuecheng, who said that we have to historicize Confucianism and ask ourselves, what would Confucius do in our circumstances? In other words, what would a virtuous person do in our historical era? Not ask ourselves, what did Confucius did? Because what Confucius did was appropriate for his context. We have to do what's appropriate for our context. So those are just an example of some of the philosophically interesting figures that I would encourage people to start with.
So I wonder whether you agree with one of the positions you've just mentioned, Bryan, because there's reason to think Plato said something similar about how if you know the good, you do it, right? And I wonder about that, though, because I think I know that I shouldn't eat as much pizza as I do, but I still do.
Right. Yeah, I'm actually, Wang Yangming was responding to an earlier Confucian, Zhu Xi, and Zhu Xi said that there's kind of a two-step process in ethical cultivation. He said, first you have to learn what is good. But he said at the beginning, your knowledge is shallow, so it may not motivate you.
Uh-huh.
Then you have to, and this, he has an interesting analysis of how weakness of the will occurs. So I assume you're on a diet where you're not supposed to be eating pizza.
Well, not as much.
My condolences. Yeah, my condolences. Right. So, because pizza is wonderful, as we know.
It is a good.
It is a good, yes. I think that's a Platonic truth.
It's in moderation.
Yes. So Zhu Xi would say, okay, you do know that you shouldn't have this, whatever 10th slice of pizza, say. But what happens in the moment when you eat the piece of pizza anyway is that you have, at least for a moment, engaged in self-deception. You've lied to yourself by masking your knowledge for a moment so that you can successfully eat the piece of pizza.
Uh-huh.
So you're still responsible for your action because you're the one who chose to lie to yourself about your ethical knowledge, to not pay attention to it for a moment. But in the instant in which you do it, it is masked, the knowledge is masked from yourself, and that's why you're capable of acting against it.
What a fascinating position.
Yeah, it is. And it's not the same as...
A level of self-deception is not the same as self-deception.
Yeah, it's in a way, as you know, Aristotle gives an account of how this kind of weakness of will is possible, but this is interestingly different. And personally, I find, Zhu Xi's account more compelling than Aristotle's account.
I'm actually persuaded. You're right. I like Aristotle's account because it helps explain something that I think Plato's idealistic about, but I also think he's kind of hardline about it in a way that your explanation is more nuanced, or the one you've just presented.
Yeah. And so I tend to agree with Zhu Xi about a lot of things, but Wang Yangming does present a lot of arguments on this topic. So, for example, one of the things he says, well, knowledge of the good is an example of one of those kinds of knowledges that intrinsically involves a motivating experience. So, for example, he says, if you want to know what hunger is, you have to have felt hunger. If you want to know what the good is, you have to have been attracted to it. So it's impossible. If you say, oh, I know that I shouldn't eat the pizza, Wang says, we don't claim that people know something just because they say they know it.
Right.
In other words, like a 5-year-old could be trained to say E equals MC squared, Einstein's famous formula.
Right.
A 5-year-old doesn't know that E equals MC squared. That's an advanced truth in physics. Right. And so you say, oh, I know that I'm not supposed to eat it. Wang says, so what? People say a lot of things they don't actually know to be true.
That is a fascinating answer. Yeah.
So this is an example. If you look at this stuff and you say, oh, yeah, that's not philosophy, I just don't know what to do with you. And then I guess Plato and Aristotle aren't philosophers either because they discuss this issue and similarly provide arguments.
Yep.
And
Correct.
That's awesome. Well, this is slightly off topic, but something I've actually been kind of curious about. China today sort of is a communist country. To what extent does communism conflict or sort of resonate with Confucian philosophy?
China today is only nominally communist.
Right.
And President Xi Jinping of China has gone out of his way to endorse Confucianism as a philosophy that the Chinese people should learn from and embrace. So that's one of the reasons it's important for the next generation of diplomats, Congress people, and even just informed citizens to learn about Confucianism so they can have an informed opinion about what the future of China is going to be.
Now, is that distancing from communism part of Confucianism, or is Confucianism somehow resonant with communism?
Well, I think the danger of what Xi Jinping's doing is that the classics are classics for a reason. And if you tell people to take seriously Confucianism, you're telling them to take seriously a doctrine that has been used for a couple thousand years to oppose authoritarianism and to fight for the rights of the common people. And so in the long run, I think this may backfire for Xi Jinping.
I mean, that was kind of why Mao was, at least one of the reasons Mao was so against Confucianism.
Exactly. Mao just absolutely hated Confucianism and tried to get rid of it. Although one of his subordinates, Liu Shaoqi, did try to synthesize Marxism and Confucianism in a really interesting way.
Anthony, we're going to have to invite Bryan back on because this is absolutely fascinating stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, I had an idea for a segment we could just do regularly on the show now.
I like that. Excellent. I can't wait to hear about that. Well, everybody, we're going to come back after a short break with one more segment with Dr. Bryan Van Norden talking about a multicultural manifesto relating to his book, Taking Back Philosophy. This is Philosophy Bakes Bread. I'm Eric Weber, and my co-host is Anthony Cashio. We'll be right back.
Welcome back, everyone, to Philosophy Bakes Bread. This is Anthony Cashio and Eric Weber, and today we have been talking with and learning a whole bunch from Dr. Bryan Van Norden, and we've been talking about his idea about a multicultural manifesto, expanding the idea of what philosophy is and can be, and his most recent book called Taking Back Philosophy. In this final segment, we're going to conclude with a big picture question or two for Bryan. We will talk about baking some bread. We may even have a joke or two, and then we'll end with a question for everyone to think about and ponder as we go about our days.
So Confucius, like Plato, wrote at a time when governments were pretty undemocratic. Now, I just heard something about that, about democracy, or at least anti-authoritarianism in our last segment, but I need to return to that subject and ask, is Confucius's philosophy in conflict with democratic values?
I don't think so, but this is a topic that's been hotly debated by Chinese intellectuals, especially in the 20th and now the 21st century. So certainly Confucius was, like most pre-modern philosophies and most philosophers in most cultures, including the West, not an advocate of democracy, but he thinks that the ultimate test of government is whether or not you have satisfied the needs of the common people. And later philosophers in the Confucian tradition have argued that the way to achieve this is by putting constraints on the authority of the ruler and making sure that there are other centers of power in government so that they can balance one another. So you actually find this kind of sophisticated doctrine within the Confucian tradition. Recently, some thinkers have argued, Joseph Chan at the University of Hong Kong is one of the leading thinkers on this topic, that you can make Confucianism consistent with democracy, even though it's not something that Confucius himself advocated. He argues that the key ideas of Confucianism are not inherently inconsistent with democracy.
So in a sense, the jury's still out, but there's strong advocates for saying that Confucius's views were potentially consistent with democracy.
Yeah, I look at it like I look at Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle's views on gender are at the least sexist.
At the least.
And arguably, arguably misogynistic, like when he says that a woman is a deformed man.
Oof.
But then you find all these outstanding philosophers who happen to be women, like Martha Nussbaum. And if you say, well, how can you be a big fan of Aristotle, as Nussbaum at the University of Chicago is, when he's so sexist? And they said, oh, yeah, his sexism is ultimately completely repellent, but that's not something that's essential to his philosophy. That's something that we can identify, acknowledge is bad, but get rid of because there are key insights in Aristotle about human character and ethical cultivation and even the structure of the universe that we can hold on to that are not tied to his views about gender. So the fact that Confucius is ultimately a paternalist in the sense that he thinks that the government knows better than the common people doesn't mean that we can't take many of his insights about the ultimate goal of government and the goal of getting virtuous people into positions of authority and make those consistent with a largely democratic form of government.
Interesting. Very nice.
I do like that. I like that. So, Bryan, one last question for you. We're going to do something unusual and circle back to our first segment. We asked you to tell us what philosophy was, and you gave us this wonderful answer. It seems throughout your book, right, Taking Back Philosophy has a lot to do about that question in general, about what philosophy is and how we ought to think about it and sort of where lines ought to be drawn, if there should be lines at all, sort of around the boundaries of philosophy. So we thought we'd do something unusual and come back to that question. Is it possible to have a philosophy that isn't bound to a culture? How do you understand sort of multicultural philosophy? Do you sort of have a vision for sort of philosophy going forward from here?
I'm part of the philosophical movement that we might broadly describe as hermeneutics. I teach a course that is a seminar for advanced students on modernism, postmodernism, and hermeneutics, these three broad approaches to how to do philosophy. And oversimplifying to a great degree, just to get the point across to our audience, modernism is the view that there's some ultimate foundation for knowledge that is ideally indubitable, and there's a method for building on that foundation. Postmodernism denies that there are any firm foundations for knowledge and that there are just these pockets of rationality that, are incommensurable with one another. The hermeneutic tradition, as I understand it, is the view that you have to start from within some cultural tradition. But that doesn't mean that you're stuck within that cultural tradition, because the one thing we know about cultural traditions is they transform over time and they are not hermetically sealed from other traditions. One of my favorite examples is Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century at the University of Paris, and students practically rioted when they reintroduced Aristotle into the curriculum. Because at that point, students at the University of Paris, now the Sorbonne, were just studying a kind of Platonized Christianity. And so people said, oh, Aristotle, he's not part of our tradition. You're watering down the curriculum. This is not being faithful to who we are. But Aquinas won and got Aristotle back into the philosophical curriculum in the West, and the tradition was much richer because of it.
Boy, did he do that in a big way.
Exactly. So I think it's important to remember, you have to start from within a tradition, because where else would you start? But the only way you can have confidence in your tradition is through constructive dialogue with other traditions, learning from what they have to offer and testing your ideas against theirs.
Beautifully said.
I think that's a beautiful summary of your point about a multicultural manifesto, and that very helpfully sums it up. In every episode, we have a moment in the last segment in which we return to kind of the theme of this show, the notion that philosophy bakes bread, which is a response to the famous phrase that philosophy may bake no bread, as the saying goes, right? And so we've talked in a number of moments in this episode about some sort of bread baking in a way, Bryan, but I'm sure there's more things that kind of we haven't yet touched on. And I want to invite you to suggest if there are any kind of key last thoughts you want to add about ways in which if I'm not mistaken, you do seem to think that metaphorically philosophy bakes bread. So is there any final thought or additional one or two kind of examples of bread baking that you can think of from other traditions than the Western tradition?
Oh, yes. I think maybe the most impressive example is the relevance of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism to shaping not just the attitudes of a handful of intellectuals, but the basic worldview of people of many people in the Chinese tradition and other traditions that have been influenced by them. What I often tell my students, for example, to bring it back to the European tradition for a second, is whether you have even heard of Descartes, you're influenced by Descartes' ideas. Whether you've ever heard of Kant, you're influenced by Kantian ideas. The only question is, are you going to be self-aware enough that you understand what Descartes and Kant actually said so that you can think constructively about your own ideas? Likewise, even people who haven't read Confucius or even people who haven't read the Buddhist sutras can be influenced by those ideas. And the question is whether we are going to have an informed opinion about how they are approaching the world by reading and learning about the texts that are central to their mindset.
Very interesting. I remember when I lived in Mississippi that the governor often went to a number of different countries in Asia, and especially South Korea, but not only. But there's so much business with China that you want to have an understanding of the world and the world of ideas if you want to do a good job interacting with people in other countries and getting them to do business with you, seems to me.
Exactly. We live in an increasingly multicultural world, and so we have to become increasingly multicultural in our worldview. And that doesn't have to mean giving up our previous commitments, but it means having the open-mindedness to engage in dialogue with other traditions.
Very nice.
I like it.
Excellent. Yeah. Anthony, you want to introduce the next?
Yeah, I think we've earned the right. Tell some jokes. So, this last segment or the next segment we call Philosoph-Funny. So, as you know, Bryan, we want people to know both that philosophy has both a serious side and a lighter side. So, in our next segment, which we call Philosoph-Funnies,
say Philosoph-Funnies.
Philosoph-Funnies.
Say Philosoph-Funnies.
Philosoph-Funnies.
it's Eric's quickly growing boy. We'd love to hear your sort of favorite joke, philosophy joke, funny fact, funny story about philosophy, multiculturalism, Asian, anything really. We will judge you harsh.
Okay. All right. So my kids like to make fun of me for always telling this story every chance I get. So supposedly this ancient philosopher is discussing his theory of the cosmos. And he explains that, well, the Earth is a hemisphere which is on the back of a turtle that carries it around the sun. And student in the audience looks thoughtful as the professor continues the lecture, and he raises his hand. The professor says, "Oh, yeah, what?" And the student says, "What is the turtle that is carrying the Earth supported by?" And the master says, "Oh, no problem. It's on the back of another turtle." And he goes back to his lecture, and the student looks a little puzzled, raises his hand again and says, "I'm sorry, master, the turtle that's carrying the Earth is on the back of a turtle. What is that turtle supported by?" The master says with some exasperation, "He's on the back of a turtle." Anyway, as I was saying, the student is starting to get kind of frustrated, raises his hand again, and the master says, "Look, I know what you're going to ask. It's turtles all the way down." Now, it's kind of an absurdist joke at one hand, but you'd be surprised how often I have occasion to tell this to illustrate various philosophical points. So, for example, there are two schools of thought in Buddhism. One claims that there are these ultimate simples called the skandhas, which are like momentary configurations of physical or mental states, which are the ultimate basis of everything else that exists. So there's no self as we understand it, but there are these ultimate physical or mental states that are transient. But other Buddhists in the Mahayana tradition, like Zen Buddhists, for example, or Huayan Buddhists, like Thong I talked about earlier, they say, no, everything is relationally defined all the way down. The skandhas are themselves dependent on other entities, so they're not ultimate reals either. So what I tell my students is, do you think it could be relations all the way down, and so it never bottoms out with anything, like the Huayan Buddhists? Or do you think that's crazy? The last turtle has to be standing on something. And that thing the last turtle is standing on is these instantaneous, transient configurations of mental and physical states.
Fantastic. I've never heard the full sort of explanation of how we can make this philosophy, except I suppose in epistemology, in the theory of knowledge. How do you know that? Well, because of this. Well, how do you know that? Well, because of this.
That's another excellent illustration of
turtles all the way down.
This story. It has a lot of ways you can apply it.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, so for each episode, Anthony and I gather jokes that are good or bad. Well, we try anyway, right? And in this case, since we're talking about a multicultural manifesto, we thought we'd look for jokes that have to do with open-mindedness versus narrow-mindedness. And so to start out, Anthony had actually told me about this, but he asked me to tell it. So it's a joke about a particular, well, in this particular case, it was a Trump supporter who apparently said, well, don't be so open-minded that your brain falls out.
I've heard that used in other contexts.
Well, everyone knows a narrow mind is usually accompanied by a wide mouth.
I like that one. Here's one. Have you met Al? He's so narrow-minded he can see through a keyhole with both eyes.
That's a cute one.
You know, Eric, I'm a little tired today. I had a lot of fun last night, but I found out two important things.
Oh, yeah?
One, kitchen sex can be wild and exciting.
Whoa.
Two, the staff at McDonald's are quite narrow-minded.
Yeah, that's my favorite.
that was pretty good.
All right. Well, last but not least, we do want to take advantage of the fact that today we have powerful social media that allow for two-way communications, even for programs like radio shows. So we want to invite our listeners to send us their thoughts about big questions that we raise on the show today.
That's right. Given that, Bryan, we'd love your thoughts about what question you think we should pose for our listeners for a segment that we call You Tell Me. We invite people on sometimes, again, to talk about listener feedback. Well, we want to solicit feedback, and so we ask you, what question should we ask listeners?
One question I like to give my students is, when you're on your deathbed, hopefully a long, long time in the future, and you look back on your life, what kind of accomplishment do you think will make you proud of the life you've lived?
Ooh.
Are you going to be proud about how much money you earned? Are you going to be proud of what a nice car you bought in 2019? Or are you going to be proud of things like the time that you showed integrity in a time of crisis, or the time you stood up for somebody who couldn't defend themselves, or the time you spent with your family?
I love it.
Wow, that's a good one. We're going to give everyone a nice existential crisis.
Yeah, we want to hear from you all, folks.
Well, thank you, everyone, for listening to Philosophy Bakes Bread. Your hosts, Anthony Cashio and Eric Weber, are very grateful today to have been joined by Bryan Van Norden. Thank you again for joining us, Bryan.
Thank you, Bryan.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was a really wonderful conversation. I'm excited to get you back on and talk some more. We hope our listeners enjoyed the conversation as well, and that you will join us again. Consider sending us your thoughts about anything you've heard today that you'd like to hear about in the future, or about the specific questions we've raised for you, especially the one that Bryan just raised. You're on your deathbed. You're thinking back on your life. What do you think you'll be proud of?
What do you want to be proud of? Yeah.
What do you want to be proud of?
I like it. I really like that question. So remember, everyone, you can catch us on Twitter, Facebook, and on our website at philosophybakesbread.com. And there you'll find transcripts for many of our episodes, thanks to Drake Bowling, an undergraduate student at the University of Kentucky. Thank you, Drake.
Thanks, Drake.
And thanks also to Stephen Barrera for help with the production of this show. He's a recent graduate here at the University of Kentucky.
Thank you, Stephen.
And one more thing, folks, if you want to support the show and to be more involved in the work of the Society of Philosophers in America, the easiest thing to do is to go consider joining as a member. Head over to philosophersinamerica.com.
If you are enjoying this show, we hope you will take a second to rate and review us on Apple Podcast or iTunes or wherever you're finding us today. All good reviews help us reach more people, bake more bread, and take back philosophy. Yeah. Yep. You can, of course, email us at philosophybakesbread@gmail.com. And you can also call us and leave a short recorded message with a question or a comment that we may be able to play on the show. You can reach us at 859-257-1849. That's 859-257-1849. Join us again next time on Philosophy Bakes Bread, food for thought about life and leadership.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.